Hi, everyone. Ed Bixby here from the Global Green Burial Alliance, and this is Spotlight Now. Today, I'm here with Nathan Romagnoli of ecofuneral. Nathan is a licensed funeral director and embalmer with 26 years' experience in the funeral industry. Driven by a creative and entrepreneurial spirit, he founded Eco Cremation and Burial Services Incorporated, where he helps families across Niagara, Peel, Toronto, and the greater Golden Horseshoe create personalized and meaningful funeral experiences. By taking an organic and flexible approach to every aspect of the funeral process, Nathan works closely with families to provide services that truly reflect their values, whether focused on affordability, environmental consciousness, or unique personal touches. His goal is to make funeral planning more accessible, thoughtful, and individualized, offering what he describes as truly out-of-the-box funerals. So welcome, Nathan.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I mean, we're really glad that we can introduce you to our community. And why don't we get started by learning a little bit more about your background and how you entered the death care world?
Sure. Yes, it's a question I oftentimes get asked. My story is a little bit funny, I suppose, like many people in the funeral industry. So, actually, in high school, when I was growing up in the region of Niagara, I took a job at a local funeral home, mainly doing their gardens and some of their kind of interior maintenance work. And it was a job I had all through high school, and that's kind of how I got started in the field.
Well, and it's obviously your calling. You're still doing it. I'm sure you have a great passion for it. And with your company, I'm sure you have a variety of funeral options. And I understand you offer a wide range of services. So could you tell our viewers a little bit about what you have to offer and how you guys offer it?
Absolutely. So in our company, we're a very broad-based company, both geographically and service-wise. And though our name is called Eco, we tend to also focus a lot on serving traditional families who perhaps admire and respect the traditional elements of funeral services, whether that's their spiritual flow of their funerals, coming into a Roman Catholic church for a funeral mass, or having traditional visitations. We do a lot of traditional type of work. But I think that even in the traditional community, the families that choose us are families that are seeking something that's different from the average that they have maybe been used to in their funeral experiences in their past. So we tend to serve a lot of what I think would be kind of educated families and people who are very astute in their own decisions, and people who might live a little bit more responsibly. So even though we serve a huge amount of traditional families, obviously our focus is on the environmental side of things. And sometimes what that does is it allows for traditional families to incorporate more environmentally sustainable options into their traditional funeral practices. So what that can look like is various different things. It might look like the family being offered the ability to still have their loved one cared for by means of embalming. However, we at ECO offer an alternative method of embalming, which is a non-formaldehyde based ability to do so. So some families really respect this ability of marrying up their tradition, the desire to still, visit with their loved one as they are used to, but in a more environmentally sustainable way. Nothing says that though you're having a traditional funeral, you can't choose a casket, for example, something that's behind me made of 100% biodegradable materials. So we oftentimes have traditional families marrying up with more environmental options, if not serving families who are exclusively green, and take that to a very, very serious standard by the whole effect of their funeral, how their loved one is cared for, respecting the fact that we, as a company, we fabricate our own burial shrouds here on site, and so many families will partake in shrouding their loved one with us within our care here, and also placing their loved one in a biodegradable casket if their choice is for burial. Choosing even sort of rental options for their caskets and other types of materials if they choose to have, again, more traditional things, a visitation, a funeral service, we like to remind families that even though they might go green, it doesn't mean that they have to eliminate the possible desire for traditional elements.
But absolutely. And I mean, just looking behind you, the beauty in natural products. I mean, there's no reason why people, shouldn't consider, and people already do integrate that into their traditional services. It's all about options, and you'll inspire people through this by offering it to it. It may not be the person you're serving, but the family members that are attending the
Yes.
actual service. So, no, it's a very good, good way to introduce your value system and allow people to pick and choose. So I commend you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do tend to find that we have a younger clientele as well, whether that means the deceased person being a younger person who may have died, or the decision makers in a family. So, for example, I'm a 44-year-old individual. If I was to bury my parents and I'm the decision maker, then we're having a lot of families who are on the younger side, being those decision makers, and those younger people are a bit more in tune with what they want. They value certain methods, certain ethics, and that's where the ethos of eco, I think, is very identifiable to people.
Right, absolutely. And, obviously you've been doing this for quite a while. You've made a career out of it. What initially piqued your interest in offering eco-friendly services to your community? I mean, what was it something that people were asking for, or is it something that was near and dear to your heart?
It's a great question. So my family, I mean, nature is something that's always been important to me, and I think my family too. I grew up in a family of Italian immigrants who came from the old country and settled in a rural area and made a living through farming. And so, as a child, I was, always on the farm, and in fact, I worked for my grandfather from the age of 10 years old. My grandfather had a spring, a water spring that came from the earth, and we would bottle water and sell it to our local communities. So I feel like being out and connected into the nature was always something that was important for me. I have a huge respect for water and all living things, trees and animals and all of those things. But I suppose in my journey through the funeral world, as a professional, I was very young, as you know, when I became a funeral director. I think I was 22 years old, perhaps, after working at the funeral home since I was 16. I felt like I was always different, and my viewpoints on life and society and the appreciation of beautiful things was different than the average person. And I think that that's what sort of caused me to struggle a bit in my funeral service career, because there was nothing like what we do at Eco when I first started out. There was no such thing. Um, I worked in very traditional funeral homes, which I certainly respect. I love tradition and I love ritual and I love spirituality. But working under these environments, either with owners that were unable to have a level of creativity to expand their realm or do things a little bit differently, it was challenging for me, and and I had a rough go, honestly, knowing that I love the work that I do, but not being able to make, ends meet, to be truthful. I worked as a funeral director for many, many, many years, and still, at nighttime in Toronto, I was having to wait tables just to make ends meet, and I thought this is tough stuff. Um, so I took a job in a corporate funeral setting, thinking that perhaps I might be able to expand my whole realm. I might be able to have some influence on a larger company versus, say, a husband and a wife team who owned a funeral home. So while that experience it was very good for me, working for a national conglomerate. It also was challenging because I, again, was limited by corporate kind of demands and corporate standard and corporate expectation and bottom line this and bottom line that. Um, but the one good thing that came out of that is that I was moved out to the west coast of Canada, to Vancouver Island, to take over a funeral home that was 100 years old. So a super interesting thing had happened. this 100-year-old, very iconic funeral establishment, super traditional, based in its uh, philosophy of how they started. The community was changing rapidly, and on Vancouver Island, there's a lot of very environmentally focused people, much the same as anywhere down the west coast of the United States. And and I really came into the public's mindset of what's important to them and how certain old traditions are no longer what they like, and that being connected to nature and perhaps being a secular person, not religious, that their religion was nature. Um, so I really learned how people connected their spiritual self with nature, and saw the focus of environmentally focused citizens there. So when I left that job, I brought that home to me in Toronto, where we obviously live in a huge cosmopolitan city base with millions of people and huge amounts of different cultures and languages and all kinds of things. And to be the first environmentally focused funeral establishment in all of Ontario was a really big deal for me. Um, so that's kind of how the flow it happened, and that's how the environmental side that I tapped into it, knowing that there was a need and knowing that anybody can kind of bury a body, anybody can get a funeral done, but very few companies or people can get it done with a greater philosophy, and that's where I felt that I personally brought value, and that I think that Eco as a company brings a greater value is we let people die the way that they lived. So it's a full circle.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, obviously you had a calling, and you had your finger on the pulse, understanding that not only was the industry changing, even if people didn't see it or want to understand that it was, but it was the consumer who was changing the industry. So, that
Absolutely.
was very, very wise of you, and a very good choice, to be ahead of the curve, and to help others, pave the way. So, that's interesting, but I think everything happens for a reason, that's for sure. And, you know, I understand that, in Canada, the aquamation process, or water cremation in general, it's been a little slower to implement. What have you seen concerning that in your offerings?
That's totally valid. Canada has been quite slow in the progression of death care. We're very, very fortunate in Ontario, kind of smack in the middle or slightly to the east of the country, that we are able to offer alkaline hydrolysis, or like we call it, aquamation. Very fortunate to have that. So yeah, I mean, you mentioned something earlier about how the consumers dictate what they want, and this is totally true. So even before we at Eco began to publicly offer aquamation services, which was quite a contentious topic, there was a lot of red tape, a lot of corporate dynamic that was sort of squashing the concept of aquamation entering our province. Before we even began to offer it, our consumers were asking for it. Again, these are people that are educated, that they watch things, they research things, like your standpoint right now. A lot of our clients would already know about your channel and the things that you offer. So when we listen to our consumers, we respond to them. And so that's what prompted us to be able to um, truly delve into the aquamation concept. And though we certainly respect people who still choose fire-based cremation for cultural or spiritual reasons or just general preference, we always like for people to understand that there is now an alternative which can be heavily considered, um, much more environmentally sound. And so just giving people that option is a powerful mode, and it allows us to challenge ourselves as funeral professionals as to how do we serve those families. So it's been super interesting, some things I've learned as a professional, how to again marry up the wishes of families while implementing aquamation. So by no means do we have to have everybody directly acclimated with no gatherings, no services, no whatever? Um, so we've been able to kind of come into concepts of how do we use products like rental caskets, and we implemented a brand new product very recently, which is a chaise, meaning like an open full scale concept of a casket, but it's very low profile, almost like their loved one was sort of laying on a couch, if you will. And so we can have families visit together with their loved ones, and as we know, with acclimation, we are not acclimated within a casket or a container. So this presents a logistical problem. What do we do with the container? We don't want to be wasteful and have to burn a rental casket insert or throw something in the garbage, if you will. So the chaise option, or a visiting platform, which in fact we manufactured and created on site for ourselves at Eco, is a reusable platform that's very lovely, very practical, but also minimizes the waste so that families can visit together with their loved ones. We can bring their body into a place of worship or ritual if they would like that, and we're not left with a casket that we have to dispose of thereafter. So those are things that I've learned, and they've been very rewarding experiences to try to jump those hurdles of logistics while implementing acclimation.
And I'm glad you were able to bring up those points to the consumer. I mean, like you said, you can still have a celebration, you can still be part of the service. It's a lovely way to honor the person and still be involved in that process. And you guys are being innovative. And in this industry, kind of being pioneers, let's say a little bit, you have to be innovative because some of these things don't exist. So
That's
you're
right.
helping create, products for the future. And
Yes,
I've been to Toronto. It's a lovely city for any of the viewers who have not. I mean, I encourage a visit. And culturally, it's very diverse. So, with that being said, how do you feel green funeral options may align or fit into the culture of Toronto, let's say, and the lifestyle of your community? Because there are so many different types of people.
it's a great question. I think it'll take a little bit longer for say the cultures that are of which their spiritual life is embedded in their daily life, uh, to catch on sort of the extreme of a green funeral. I mean, I don't see, for example, the Hindu community, of which we have many Hindu families living in our community. I don't see them suddenly changing their desire for typical fire-based cremation and going into acclamation, because fire is such an important element for them in their spirituality. But I do see, say, some of those very cultured families and families whose funeral practices are dictated by their faith. I do see them being a bit more open to the concepts of more environmentally sustainable options. Example, our formaldehyde-free embalming capacity. There's no reason why a family that's a bit more modern and responsible, but operates a very traditional faith base, wouldn't want to explore certain things. So I think that our niche within eco is definitely within the there's a very specific niche of our family who chooses us, and they often are a family that's, as I mentioned before, quite educated, very astute in their manner of how they decide things, really, and how they live their own lives. Um, uh, People who have a philosophy of the environment and what's important for them, and possibly people who, again, don't operate with a traditional sense of spirituality, meaning a Roman Catholic faith or a Muslim faith, but are choosing greater spirituality as their religion, greater spirituality, being connected to the earth, being connected to the trees, connected to nature. It's those people of which uh, Toronto, Niagara alike, we have so many people. Niagara particularly is famous for its agriculture, right? We are people who made a living from the earth, literally. So I think that the connection now to the earth, notwithstanding all of the environmental challenges we have with greenhouse gases and all of the bad stuff that we live with and that we've created ourselves, our own communities are gravitating more to more responsible decisions, and that's where we find that people choose us.
No, and you're absolutely correct. I mean, oddly enough, what you said resonates with me in the sense that when I first started in this 20 years ago, my customer base, when it was very, very small here in the States, really were very highly educated people who were seeking out, a particular option that they were desiring. But what I found over time was that as more people became aware and experienced it, it changed rapidly. So I predict that probably will start to happen as well, and you may already be starting to see that. But there is definitely a place for everyone. We all come from the earth, like as you mentioned, and no matter what your race, religion, or spirituality is, you can accept and buy into that concept. So
Absolutely.
I see great things coming, for Toronto and for the work that you guys are doing. And I always ask because it's always nice to, we have near and dear memories from all of these things. Are there any eco-friendly funeral services that you had provided that might have been especially impactful for you that you might want to share with the consumer? Because visually, we love to tell stories because it captures people's hearts and minds.
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, this might sound cliche, but every family that we serve is very, very special. And I've always said that in our company, if we were able to put the deceased folks together in one room, they would all be friends. They would all be the most amazing people together, and also their living family members would all be friends too. So we've served some really, really incredible human beings. That have contributed immensely to our world, and whether it's in their professions or just in their personal lives. But I I, I think one funeral that always sticks out in my mind, when you asked me this, it kind of immediately brought this up. So this was a family that at first glance wouldn't have thought that they would have opted for a very hardcore green funeral. They were a family from the West Indies, who typically operate in a relatively Christian-based traditional manner. And but again, people having different philosophies of their own life. When they inquired with us, mom had died at home, and they we went to their home, of course, to care for their mom and bring her into our care. And this family of young people, they were perhaps 4 or 5 children of the deceased lady. They were the decision makers. And like I said earlier, when we work with younger people, they're far more in tune with modern modes. So what we crafted for their mother was something incredibly beautiful. And we traveled hours out of the Toronto area to a very, very beautiful cemetery that we're super fortunate in Ontario to have, where literally inside of the cemetery is a legitimate forest. And so when people sort of joke around all the time and say, bury me under a tree, which we know necessarily is not in a traditional cemetery, not necessarily possible unless perhaps, where you're standing in the old section of the cemetery there has trees, but those are hundreds of years old, perhaps, and those graves are unlikely to be available. But we're super fortunate to have this beautiful cemetery called Glenwood in Picton, Ontario, of which has a forest, stunning forest, huge. And part of that forest has become registered cemetery land. And so this particular family, they were so hands-on and they were so surprising to me. Um, just because they were not the typical family that I would have thought would have chosen this mode for their mom. And they carried their mom in one of our willow caskets to their grave together, very, very unified. I feel like when we have green-based services, there's a level of intimacy that is far greater than a non-green funeral. So everything to do with the funeral is far more special. It's more personal. These children wrapped their own mother in her burial shroud. Um, they carried her themselves to her grave out in the wilderness where we were hearing the birds chirping and the you could almost hear the buds growing on the trees. It was springtime, and physically lowered her into the ground with strapping that we use. In fact, the strapping here uh, we offer for our families to lower the caskets. We have a series of, we call it our natural lowering device instead of choosing a mechanical lowering device made of metal and strapping, as you probably um, are well aware of, a series of natural boards that have been reclaimed. And so watching them lower their mom into the grave and placing flower petals, and we have biodegradable notes that we allow people to write a message on to place inside of her grave, and then to cover her with earth, literally. Um, it was just very special, and everything came from their soul, and I believe that they honored their mom in the way that she perfectly would have loved to. And that's just a really, really cool feeling to have. Driving hours and hours out of the city just to achieve these particular goals, it's always very special. But that family particularly has always stuck with me. Um, they wrote us the most loving review, and so I see that every now and again. And every time I go to the cemetery, there's a big boulder there that allows for butterflies to be attached to. And so their mom's name is on the butterfly, which is attached to the boulder. And I kind of have a special place for that family in my heart because I always say, if it wasn't for families that enact that, we would not exist, right? That we only exist for those families. So it's a very powerful mode. Anybody can put a body in the ground or put somebody in the fire to cremate them, but not anybody or not every family has the opportunity to create something that's so philosophically correct. And if you can achieve that, I think it not only lessens your burden of grief, but it truly, like truly in capital letters, can honor that person if that person lived that way, right?
No, absolutely. No, I totally agree. And I think that, you're really celebrating a life that was lived and you created a memorable experience out of what otherwise, of course, you're grief stricken, but you're there to celebrate that life. So, that sounds to me like you captured the essence of that, and that's why it was important to you.
Yes, and it takes a, people always say, again, you've heard this a million times, it takes a special person to do the work that we do. I've always said that it doesn't really. It just takes creativity and the ability to listen to people and a bit of intuition to perhaps know what a family might need before they're able to express what they need. So we have such a great team of people on our side who are like-minded and have this ability to draw out of people. Um, Emotion and philosophy and experience to actually create something that's special. So, we definitely crossed that huge line into total custom event planning and um, psychologists and therapists and artists, and all of the work that we do is, it's truly somebody said this to me, actually in person. They came up to me at a funeral last year, and they said it was very loving and very complimentary. They said, "We have watched you over the last 2 days." Their loved one's funeral was a 2-day situation, and they said, "We watched you and we watched your team." And I was like thinking, "Where's this going? What's this person saying?" I was waiting for some kind of a. Oftentimes, people, when they want to say something, it might be because it's negative, right? They want to express something negative versus a positive comment. But they said, "We've watched you for 2 days, and you and your team, you delivered this with artistry." And when he said that, it kind of hit home that that's literally what we are. We're moving artists that are crafting these experiences and delivering these experiences in a, hopefully in an artful manner that flows and is beautiful like a piece of art. And that was a huge, huge compliment. So that's what we strive for every day.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you're doing wonderful work up there. And for all the consumers and all the viewers watching this, consider visiting Nathan and checking out some of the offerings that he has. It's been a pleasure to have you here today, Nathan. We really appreciate you coming on to the Global Green Burial Alliance and sharing, your story and a little bit about who you are. And we really want to thank you. And, viewers, you can learn more by visiting ecofuneral.ca. And do you have any parting words for the viewers, Nathan?
Well, I just think it's great that you're doing the work that you do because consumers and people need a non-biased source for information, and this type of organic flow is what people gravitate to, so that they can actually come to the table with a bit of education. So, congratulations to you and all the work that you do. And like you said, we've got a really great amount of information on our website, so do feel free to visit that. And on our different social media handles, we're oftentimes known as Eco Life Celebrations. And you'll be able to see and learn some cool stuff through that as well.
Well, we really appreciate it. Thanks, viewers. I mean, certainly check Nathan out and Eco Funeral. And this is Ed Bixby from the Global Green Burial Alliance, and this was Spotlight Now.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.